Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Pesachim. We are up to Perek Tet, Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Yisraelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. We discussed earlier in Mishnah 3 the differences between the first and second Pesach offerings. This Mishnah turns to listing the differences between the original Pesach offering brought in Egypt at the time of the Exodus and the Pesach offering brought in all following generations. The Mishnah begins, Ma ben Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Dorot. How did the Pesach offering brought in Egypt differ from the Pesach offering of later generations? Pesach Mitzrayim mikacho mibe'asor. The animal used for the Pesach offering brought in Egypt was taken and set aside for an offering on the 10th of Nisan, 4 days before its slaughter, as the Torah states in Sefer Shemot, chapter 12, pasuk 23, whereas the animals used for Pesach offerings in later generations may be chosen just before they are slaughtered. V'taona za'aba gudat ezov, the Pesach offering of Egypt required that the sprinkling of its blood be done with a bundle of hyssop, al mashkof v'al shte mezuzot, upon the lintel and upon the 2 doorposts of every Jewish home, to distinguish them from Egyptian homes where the firstborn would be killed, as the Torah states in Sefer Shemot, chapter 12, psukim 22 and 23. Now clearly the reason for this law applied only to the Pesach offering of Egypt, not to all following Pesach offerings. Like we said, that whereas all following Pesach offerings require no such sprinkling. V'nechal bechipazon, the Pesach offering of Egypt was eaten in a hurried fashion, as the Torah states in Sefer Shemot, chapter 12, pasuk 11, so shall you eat it, your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in a haste. It is a Pesach offering to Hashem. Now, that is not required by all other Pesach offerings. The Gemara derives from the pasuk that we quoted that this law does not apply to all following Pesach offerings. They don't have to be eaten in a hurried fashion like the one we ate when we left Egypt. And the Mishnah says, Balayla echad, a final difference is that the Pesach offering of Egypt, like all following Pesach offerings, was eaten for only one night. Now in this regard, there is no difference between the Pesach offering of Egypt and all following Pesach offerings. The Mishnah mentions this only as a way of introducing the next difference, that the prohibition to eat chametz during Pesach applied in Egypt for only one day. Pesach dorot noeg kol shiva, whereas with the Pesach of succeeding generations, of later generations, the prohibition of eating chametz is observed all 7 days, as the Torah states in Sefer Shemot, chapter 12, pasuk 15, and psukim 19 and 20, and the Gemara derives from a verse that this applies only to later Pesachs, not to the Pesach of Egypt. And that is the end of Mishnah Hey. We continue now with Mishnah Vav. Once an animal has been consecrated as an offering, the Torah in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 27, pasuk 10, prohibits substituting another animal for it. If one does try to substitute for it, the Torah decrees that both the original offering and the substitute are sacred or holy. The substitute gets the same sanctity as the original, while the original keeps the sanctity that it has. So for example, if one has an animal consecrated as an olah offering, it is forbidden to declare about a second unconsecrated animal. This animal should be a substitute for that olah offering. If he did so, both animals are now olah offerings. Now this act of substitution, as well as the substitute animal, is called a terumah. Our Mishnah discusses the laws of a terumah performed on a Pesach offering. Amar Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said, Shamati shetimurat Pesach kereva. I heard from my teachers that the timurah, right? Shamati shetimurat Pesach kereva. I heard from my teachers that the timurah, the substitute of a Pesach offering under certain circumstances, is offered on the altar as a shalamim offering. Now, whenever an animal designated as a Pesach offering is not, for whatever reason, actually offered as a Pesach, it is brought instead as a shalamim offering, what we call motara Pesach karev shlamim. Now, the same applies to money consecrated with the sanctity of a Pesach. The Gemara on page 70b learns this from a pasuk. Now, since the timurah of a Pesach has the sanctity of a Pesach and cannot be brought as a Pesach, it or the money from its sales used for a shalamim offering, Utmurat Pesach ena kerava. And I also heard from them that the Timurah of a Pesach offering under other circumstances is not itself offered as a shelamim, rather it is left until it can be sold and the money is then used to buy a shelamim. The Mishnah will explain this law below, Veni lifaresh, but I cannot explain this teaching, for I've forgotten under which circumstances each ruling applies. And the Mishnah continues, Amar Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Yoshua, Ani afaresh, I will explain. Your teachers referred to the following case the commentators explain. An animal designated as a Pesach offering was lost before Erev Pesach, at which point a second animal was designated as a replacement. Now this replacement is not a timurah, it did not receive its sanctity from being substituted, rather it was designated independently as a Pesach offering to replace the one that was lost. The original animal was later found, so the law then depends upon when it was found. HaPesach shenimtza kodem shchitat HaPesach. If the original Pesach was found before the replacement Pesach was slaughtered, the original Pesach became a rejected offering and it therefore cannot be offered as a shelamim either. Now, since the original animal was found before he offered his Pesach, he had two animals available for offering as a Pesach, both of them acceptable. When he chose to use the replacement Pesach and slaughtered it instead of the original became dachui, rejected, and cannot be later offered even as a shelamim, because of the general rule that an offering that has once been rejected can never again become qualified to be an offering, even if the reason for its rejection no longer applies. Rather, yir'eh ad she'istaev, it is left to graze until it develops a blemish. An animal consecrated as an offering cannot be redeemed from its sanctity unless it develops a blemish that disqualifies it to be an offering, as the Torah writes in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 27, Psukim 11 and 12. This is true even where it cannot actually be brought as an offering because of its rejection. It still may not be redeemed until it develops a disqualifying blemish. V'imacher, and then it is sold. V'ikach b'damav shalamim, and the shalamim is brought and offered with its money. Now, when a blemished animal is sold, the money given for it becomes sanctified in its place, while the animal returns to an unconsecrated status, what we call chulin. The money is then used to buy another animal, which automatically becomes a shalamim. Now, although the animal itself was rejected and cannot be offered, the money from its sale does indeed have the status of a shalamim, like all Pesach offerings that are not actually offered. V'chen tmurato, and the same is true with its tmurah. The tmurah of this rejected Pesach also cannot be offered as a shalamim, meaning if after the original Pesach was rejected, the owner took another animal and designated it to be the original Pesach's timurah, the timurah animal acquires the same status as the original Pesach, therefore it too is considered rejected and unable to be offered. Rather, it is left to graze until it develops a disqualifying blemish, and then it's sold, and with the money going to buy a shelamim offering. Now, this is the case, Rabbi Akiva says, in which Rabbi Yeshua heard that the timurah of a Pesach is not offered. Achar shchitat Pesach, if, however, the original Pesach offering was found after the replacement Pesach was slaughtered, karev shelamim, the original one, which was never, so to speak, rejected, because since it was still lost and not available to be slaughtered at the proper time, it cannot be said to have been rejected when the replacement was slaughtered instead. The Mishnah, the commentators explain, the original one is itself offered as a shelamim, since it was not rejected. It's simply a leftover Pesach, which is supposed to be offered as a shelamim. V'chen tmurato, and the same is true with its tmurah, meaning if the owner performed tmurah on this Pesach that was found after the replacement was slaughtered, the tmurah animal acquires the same status as the original, and it too is offered as a shelamim. This is the case in which Rabbi Yeshua heard that the tmurah of a Pesach is offered. Since the law of the tmurah of a Pesach is identical to the law of a Pesach that was lost and found, Rabbi Yeshua's teachers could just as well have said their rulings in regard to the original Pesach itself, rather than the substitute. What could they have said? That if the original Pesach becomes rejected, it may not be offered as a shlamim, otherwise it may. The Gemara explains why in fact that they spoke of the substitute, since they could have spoken about the actual animal that got lost itself. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.